Now this part of the chapter will discuss smooth muscles and cardiac muscle fibers. Smooth muscles are spindle-shaped muscles. They are smaller than your skeletal muscles. They are uninucleated or only have a single nucleus. Compare that to your multinucleated skeletal muscle fibers. They also have the ability to divide throughout the whole life of an individual. They have the same proteins, actin, myosin, and tropomyosin, but they do not have troponin. Instead of troponin, they have another protein known as calmodulin. The smooth muscle fibers do not have the sarcomeres. So although we still have the myofibrils, the actin and myosin, but they are not in that striated pattern that we see in skeletal muscles. They lack, again, the sarcomeres, they lack striations, and although skeletal muscle fibers still contract using that same sliding filament mechanism, but because of the lack of the perfect striations that we see in skeletal muscles, the contractions of smooth muscle fibers are much slower and weaker than skeletal muscles. Smooth muscles are found in hollow structures and in organs that undergo change in volume. So for example, in the urinary bladder or in the gallbladder or in the stomach. Okay, so these fibers are going to be stretched and then they can contract, and we'll see a couple of things that are very specific for smooth muscle fibers. For the membrane activation, smooth muscle fibers do responses, they can be graded. Okay, so they can have these localized graded potentials. Smooth muscles can either be excited, so that will lead to contraction, or you can inhibit them. So again, compare that to skeletal muscle fibers. If the skeletal muscle fiber gets an order from a nerve, they are all excitatory. You cannot inhibit a skeletal muscle. But in smooth muscle fibers, some impulses are going to excite them, leading to their contractions, while others are going to inhibit them and lead to their relaxation. Now, what are the things that influence a smooth muscle to contract? So again, we have to keep on going back and forth comparing to skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles can only contract when it gets an order from the motor neuron. That is not the case with smooth muscles. Smooth muscles have what are known as spontaneous electrical activity. They have a pacemaker potential, which means they kind of have their own local batteries that can produce energy on their plasma membranes. And that allows for local activity to be in sync. So that very perfect peristaltic waves that happen in the small intestine are usually due to these pacemakers that are found within the intestine. Smooth muscles can contract in response to neurotransmitters, especially coming from the autonomic nervous system, whether sympathetic or parasympathetic. They can contract in response to hormones. They can also contract in response to local changes in their environment. So for example, changes in pH, changes in oxygen levels, changes in the osmolarity or ion concentrations in the extracellular fluid can lead to the contraction of these muscle fibers. Stretch is another topic here, where if you stretch, for example, the urinary bladder due to the accumulation of urine, that would lead to the contraction of the smooth muscles in the urinary bladder and leads to us feeling the urge to empty our bladders. So we'll talk about the spontaneous electrical activity. Again, they have this pacemaker potential. Pacemaker cells are found throughout the whole gastrointestinal tract, and that's why you have these very rhythmic contractions that happen throughout the system. They are also like peristaltic waves where parts contract and others relax in sync together in order for the substances to move through the whole system. Okay, some cardiac muscle fibers have that pacemaker potential as well. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we get to the cardiac muscles, but the pacemaker of the heart is known as the SA node or the sinoatrial node, and that means that the heart can keep on contracting due to the action of the SA node. So it's again like having a little tiny battery there. This right here are your spindle-shaped smooth muscle fibers, and you can see the nerve endings. So they will be getting autonomic nerve supply They will not be getting the somatic nerve supply that we talked about in skeletal muscles. Rather, they'll get autonomic, whether sympathetic or parasympathetic. If you look at the nerve endings in the autonomic nervous system, they do not have those, those terminal knobs that we talked about in the motor neurons. They rather have these varicosities, these little swelling ups. And these varicosities have synaptic vesicles that are also filled with neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters can vary either acetylcholine in the parasympathetic or norepinephrine, for example, in the sympathetic nervous system. Local factors that can lead to the contraction of smooth muscle fibers, for example, changes in acidity, changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, can definitely alter your smooth muscle tension. Many of the local factors like nitric oxide can induce smooth muscle relaxation. So nitric oxide is a gas, so it's not even a liquid, it's a gas that leads to the relaxation of smooth muscles of the blood vessels, leading to their dilation. And we can see, and the nitric oxide is responsible for the erection that happens due to the relaxation of the smooth muscles of the penile veins, leading to the accumulation of blood, and an erection happens. Smooth muscles can also respond to stretch. So they're kind of like rubber bands. If you stretch them, they will contract. Okay, stretching opens up mechanically gated ion channels, and that can lead to an action potential. Different kinds of smooth muscles that we have multi-unit and single-unit smooth muscles. So multi-unit smooth muscles, these are smooth muscle cells that are pretty much act independently of each other. They do not have gap junctions, and if they do, they're very few. For example, the smooth muscles of the airways of the lungs, smooth muscles of the hair follicles in the skin. We can also see them in the smooth muscles in the eye. All of these, again, pretty much each individual smooth muscle fiber works independently of each other. They do not all have to contract or relax in sync. Okay, so for example, the smooth muscles that are attached to the hair follicles in the skin, there's no need for them to contract in sync. Okay, they can, but there's definitely no need for that to happen. But in single unit muscle cells, this is where they are going to act as a group. Okay, they are connected by these gap junctions. Okay, and they'll find them in areas where you need these muscles to contract all together. For example, in the intestine, so all of these cells have to communicate together in order to pass the bolus of food through the esophagus or the chyme in the intestine. Same thing with the uterus. We have to make sure that the uterus contracts in sync together in order to deliver the baby. So you'll find where these single unit smooth muscles, they do act like a single unit where they all contract in sync together. Now for the cardiac muscle fibers, what are characteristic here is that they usually have one nucleus, sometimes two, but for, mostly you'll find in the textbooks that they're uninucleated. They do have striations, so remember when you have striations, we have that perfect arrangement of actin and myosin parallel to each other, and that will lead to strong contractions. Very characteristic and only found actually in cardiac muscle fibers are these borders in between the cells, and those are known as intercalated discs. If you open up your intercalated discs, you can find gap junctions. Gap junctions are really important because that allows for the fast passage of the action potential to the whole heart, and that's why the atrium can contract as a unit, while the ventricles can contract as another unit. The cardiac muscle fibers are also branched fibers. So one more time, your cardiac muscle cells have 1 to 2 nuclei. They are striated. They also use the sliding filament model in their contraction. They're branched cells and they have these intercalated discs. And I think maybe the next slide shows you a better image of the intercalated disc with the gap junctions. These gap junctions are extremely important in order for the heart to contract as one unit. The nodal cells, they do have the automaticity. Remember we said that they have that pacemaker ability. Okay, and they also have autorhythmicity, meaning that they are able to set the rhythm of the heart. Okay, so these nodal cells, not only do they have the ability to make their own action potential, okay, so that's known as automaticity, they also have autorhythmicity, where they can set the rhythm. If you guys remember the absolute refractory period, in the skeletal muscle, it wasn't really that much, but in the cardiac muscles, it is a lot longer. And that is in order to protect the muscles from tetanic contractions. So remember we said that tetanic contractions can happen in skeletal muscles, but the cardiac muscle cells are protected from that because of the long absolute refractory period. Now here you can see the branching of the cardiac muscles. You can see the intercalated discs, and they kind of like pieces of puzzles that fit in together. And then you can see these little gap junctions. Those are how, again, the impulse will reach all of the cardiac muscle cells very fast in order to contract as one unit. These two tables show the characteristic of the muscle cells, comparing them, so skeletal muscles, and then your smooth muscles, whether single unit or multi-unit, and then your cardiac muscles. Okay, you will see here a couple of important things to notice, that we do have your thin and thick filaments in all of them. Sarcomeres are only found in striated muscles, so you'll find them in skeletal and cardiac muscles only. You also find the transverse tubules in those two only. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is much more well developed in the skeletal muscles than others. Gap junctions are found in the parts that have to contract and sync, so your single unit smooth muscle fibers and your cardiac muscles. The source of calcium in the skeletal muscle is the sarcoplasmic reticulum only. The source of calcium for everything else is either the sarcoplasmic reticulum or the extracellular fluid. Now, calcium will attach to troponin in your striated muscle fibers. So that again is skeletal and cardiac. While remember, smooth muscle fibers do not have troponin, rather they have calmodulin. Here again compares these different kinds. So the spontaneous production of an action potential, having that ability to become a pacemaker, is found in the single unit smooth muscles and in the cardiac muscles. The effect of the nerve stimulation will always excite and contract the skeletal muscles, while in the others, the autonomic nerve supply can either excite or inhibit them. The hormones can affect all of the skeletal muscles all of the muscle fibers except for your skeletal muscles. And stretch can produce a contraction only in the single unit smooth muscles and in the cardiac muscles. But no matter how much you stretch a skeletal muscle, it will not lead to a spontaneous muscle contraction. So again, a skeletal muscle, in order to contract, needs an order from the motor neuron. And this concludes Chapter 9.